In this section, we're going to look at the neuroscience of recovery. We look at the brain regions that are implicated, and we look at some things that we could start to do to effect changes gradually. But it's important to understand that CPTSD is a brain-driven condition. Multiple traumatic events recalibrate brain structures, also brain functions. Once the brain is being recalibrated, then the effects of that could be extremely debilitating to our body, our mind. So we have exaggerated bodily symptoms. And what that is saying, what this part of the course is saying is that, please, we need as much self-compassion as possible. We cannot continue to blame everything on ourselves because you feel like you can't control things. It's been a long time you've been going through this and you've not been able to change. You've done a lot of therapy, it's not been able to help you. We are talking about complex trauma here to readapt the brain. And when the brain is being readapted, its effects, its negative effects, could be stronger than the willpower. So we shouldn't. It's not fair to blame everything on your weakness, on your lack of ability to be able to regulate your emotions properly, or your lack of tenacity to be able to get rid of your symptoms. Now, let's get started. Regions implicated in complex PTSD. Using functional brain scans, a CPTSD brain shows distinct abnormalities or dysregulations in a variety of brain regions. I've identified them. We're going to look in details at each one of them. We have the anterior cingulate gyrus, or anterior cingulate cortex, ACC for short, or you might say it in textbooks or in research papers as ACG. G for gyrus, ACG. So anterior cingulate gyrus, we have the amygdala, which is, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. We have the medial prefrontal cortex, MPFC. And we have the hippocampus. Then we have the HPA axis, which is the component of our autonomic nervous system pathways that is involved in stress response. And we're going to look at that. I promise I will not complicate this, but it's important for us to just have a general idea that when we are dealing with complex trauma, it's much more than just asking people to think positively. We have to do much more than positive thinking because there are other agencies that are against us. Being able to understand this will inform recovery, will inform self-compassion and patience. So the first part is the anterior cingulate gyrus or anterior cingulate cortex. I love to call it gyrus for some reason. The anterior cingulate cortex. Now, even without reading anything, you can look at the anterior cingulate cortex and call it what is known as the OCD box. This part of the brain is being implicated in obsessive compulsive disorder, but that is not the only thing it does. But that is the most memorable part of the ACC. It's involved in our reactivity to obsessive and compulsive symptoms. Now, in CPTSD, the ACC serves as the gear shifter. So there's the gear shifter part of the brain that gets stuck in exaggerated emotional and behavioral responses to conditioned fear. Now, if you've been traumatized, that traumatic experience is a conditioned fear. So we move into state of hyperarousal. But it boils down to the gear shifter that has become sticky. So you can't shift the gear in your car to the higher gear or to the lower gear whenever you want to, because the gearbox is sticky. Imagine driving on the motorway. You're supposed to drive 70 miles an hour, but for some reason, coming off the slip road into the one of the into the motorway, you went through that maneuver on your third gear. And you're supposed to increase your gear as you get to the motorway so that you could accelerate to 70, but the gear is not changing anymore. It's sticky. It's like stuck in one place. So the sense of stickiness of being stuck is always been associated with OCD and always been connected to anterior cingulate cortex. So the gear shifter of the brain is going through a challenging time. So we can easily get stuck on intrusive thoughts without being able to shift the gear, move those intrusive thoughts on so that we bring in more bearable thoughts. So the thought becomes the magnificent obsession that we can't run away from. It's like we become powerless because the part of the brain that's supposed to help us to be cognitively flexible is going through a hard time. So we become cognitively inflexible. And if you look at this, now let's just go through some things I've written here. ACC malfunction has also been linked to obsessive threat sensitivity. So you are extremely hypersensitive to sources of threat. So you can become paranoid. You are oversensitive to potential stressors, including things that are not particularly stressful, including innocuous uh, uh, situations that are basically harmless. So when the ACC is primed for obsessive threat sensitivity, we become extremely hypervigilant. We have compulsive and also compulsive threat response. So we become compulsive with regards to how we respond to threat. So that could include having a particular OCD habit. It could be chanting, it could be washing of hands, it could be the fear of contamination, it could be different other things that are connected to OCD tendencies found in both OCD and PTSD. So this is the part of the brain that is involved in cognitive flexibility, ACC, and it's affected in complex trauma. So we're more likely to develop OCD or have some kind of OCD of thoughts or OCD of behaviors. And if you don't want to perform your compulsions, that generates extreme anxiety in the process. So complex trauma shrinks the ACC volume. That means there's a loss of gray matter volume there. So this part of the brain has some neurons shrunk. So there is what is known as neural death with regards to the population of neurons in the ACC. And studies have shown that it's because of the overactivation of your CRH. CRH is a stimulating hormone that enables us to be able to respond to stress. But if it's overproduced, it's toxic to strategic regions of the brain, including anterior cingulate cortex. So there's a smaller volume using functional brain scans in people who've experienced complex trauma, especially from childhood. So that means they're more likely to have OCD tendencies. If you have children who've had very traumatic childbirth situation or they had some other complex neurological issues, you realize that chances are there will be some obsessive compulsive behavior. It could be repetitious speech, repetitious thoughts, or repetitious torching or counting or moving around in a circle. It's usually something is really connected to OCD tendencies. So now, what studies have shown is that there's a neurotransmitter that's been implicated here. that if you increase that neurotransmitter, the OCD tendency will decrease, and that is serotonin. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that's being implicated in the in the dysregulation of ACC. For example, if you look at different types of serotogenic properties, things that have serotonin in them or that increase your ability to secrete endogenous serotonin, like exercise, like gratitude, like kindness, like community and connections. When you're safe in an environment. If you do more of these things, you increase your levels of serotonin, or you have some diets that increase serotonin without spiking your insulin. That will enable us to decrease our OCD tendency. This research is not new. That is why if you go through the medical model, you go through to your GP, you say you have OCD. Your GP is more likely to prescribe the SSRI medication that increases serotonin neurotransmitters in the synaptic junctions in the brain. So we know that is true. So just as the first step to recovery, even without having to have processed all your repressed emotions of your complex trauma, understanding that ACC is attributed to OCD could help you to start to modify your behaviors. For example, regular exercise can increase cerebral serotonin levels, the brain serotonin levels. So you start to adjust your own behavior accordingly, and walking is one of the most powerful forms of exercise with regards to trauma. Walk as if you're late. Walk for about 45 minutes to 1 hour to 60 minutes a day for at least 5 times in a week. And when you walk, practice gratitude. That is why walking in nature is very powerful. Then walking on your treadmill. The treadmill will still perform, please. If you can't go out because it's raining, you can use your treadmill if you have one in the house. Walking in nature does a lot more for us. We're going to talk more about that. Now, so that is that. The serotonin neurotransmitter application here is it's part of the therapeutic package that in our own therapy, as a psychotherapist, we let people understand that we find this battle not just on the emotional level, but we fight it on different levels, on biochemical level, neurological level, immunological level, and even physiological level. We've got a whole bunch of somatic therapies that we do. I'm going to be sharing some of them with you later on. Now, the second one is the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is famous. It's famous because of its role in anxiety. So the amygdala is the fear and anxiety center in the brain. We call it the chief security officer. If you liken the entire brain structure to an organization, so you have a security guy right here. The amygdala is the chief security officer. Inside the amygdala department, they have millions of security guards that are working for the chief security officer. Okay. Now, if you have a security officer, you have all the personalities in the organization, and the purpose of the security officer is to secure the perimeters to ensure that there's safety, there's survival of the entire organization, of the property, and of the integrity of the organization. So it protects not just the brain proper, but also the body proper. We're going to talk more about that. Now look at it. This is interesting because the amygdala plays a very powerful role in your conditioned fear. Conditioned fears are connected to things that we've gone through in the past that have primed our brain to respond in a certain way through anticipating a potential repeat of what happens or just reliving the past. So the amygdala plays a primary role in the acquisition and expression of conditioned fear and in the magnification of emotional memory. So it magnifies emotional memory. So the emotional memories are stored in the amygdala system. The amygdala has its own innate memory and it's dedicated to emotional memories. So a lot of traumatic events are emotionally tagged. So depending on the intensities and the tones of the emotions that are attached to a trauma, that will determine how the amygdala rates your threat levels. And we've mentioned CRH, which is a peptide that is a precursor to your cortisol. But the CRH also has numerous amounts of receptors. Receptors are like the keyhole, where the key of a door, we have to go inside to unlock that door. So the key are the neurotransmitters, and the keyhole are the receptors, the neurotransmitter we have to unlock the keyhole, which is the receptor, so that it goes into the nucleus of that cell, of that neuron, where it starts to modify the DNA. So there are a whole bunch of CRH receptors in the amygdala, and the amygdala uses the CRH, which is performing the CRH, which is performing as a neurotransmitter. Remember, neurotransmitter, if this is the first time you're hearing this, is a chemical messenger. For example, your serotonin is a chemical messenger of feel good. So if the brain wants to send feel good factor across your brain, it bursts one of the vesicles of the neurotransmitters, serotonin, and it disseminates it. Okay, so serotonin is a chemical substance like a messenger. I've mentioned peptide today, PEPTIDE, peptide. Peptides are neurotransmitters as well, but they do long distance journey messaging, just like your FedEx and your DHL. Possibly they do long distance delivery. Then perhaps I know Royal Mail also does that. But let's say the Royal Mail just focuses on the United Kingdom. So your serotonin is a neurotransmitter. Your CRH that we've been talking about is a peptide. So it has the ability to go on a long distance journey down into the nucleus of each neuron of your cell where proteins are produced. So what is going on right here is that the amygdala uses the numerous amount of receptors of CRH to quickly discover how life is treating you. If your environment is very toxic, if you're going through a child abusive situation, you're going through a very toxic divorce situation, or you're going through a work-related bullying situation, so your body increases the production of CRH, which is going to be sensed in the amygdala system. And the more CRH you are producing, that is instructing the amygdala that your world is getting more dangerous. So the amygdala is in charge of activating your fight or flight based on the millions of receptors that populate the amygdala neurons. So just keep that like that because I'm going to be building on that. Now, hyperactivation of the amygdala center has been observed in complex trauma. Now, hyper, do you see that? Hypo is low activation. Hyper is excessive activation. And when the fear and anxiety center works too hard, you feel that in your body as exaggerated anxiety symptoms. So we have structures of the brain that have been changed as a result of how life has treated us. And that makes almost our symptoms almost as if they are long term. That is why we need a lot of patience when we're trying to recover. It doesn't just go overnight. It takes time for neurogenesis, for the neuroplasticity to happen. So we need a lot of patience with regards to recovery. So I've got a detailed step-by-step guide for you with regards to recovery that we're going to be looking at this afternoon. Now, individuals with borderline personality disorder and early abuse, which is characterized by CPTSD, have been found to have smaller amygdala volume, and this is very significant. Now, usually in anxiety disorder, if you just have anxiety, studies have shown that your amygdala volume actually increases. Yes, if they use functional brain scan to scan your amygdala volume, and they compare with the average amygdala volume of the average human that's already been measured, because they have to compare your own amygdala with the reference amygdala, which is the average of everyone else, to see whether it's smaller or it's larger. So realize that for anxiety disorder patients, the amygdala volume increases. And that makes sense. It makes a neurological sense because we still believe in the use it or lose it philosophy. So if you use it, it gets bigger. If you don't use it, you lose it. That's how the neurons in the brain work. That's how they work. It's the survival of the fittest. There's a neuropruning always going on. Any part of the brain you're not using as effectively as possible will be losing neurons, because other neurons will be stealing, making stuff, making glues and glial cells and the different other brain-derived neurotropic factors to other regions of the brain that are in business, are busy. That's why they say if you retire, don't just don't just retire. Still use your brain, otherwise you're going to lose it. So the brain is in charge of usage. You cannot skive when you work in the company of the brain, because it's constantly restructuring itself for effectiveness and for conservation. Now, it makes sense that if you are going through an anxiety situation, that your amygdala, which you are using most of the time to increase, to recruit more neurons to increase, but it's counterintuitive for the amygdala to actually shrink when you need it the most. And that's what studies have shown in CPTSD. Now, what studies have shown is that even though you lose some gray matter with regards to the amygdala volume, it does not reduce its activity. It actually goes crazy even more, because the little neurons there are now working shifts to go crazy on you, hyperactivation. So that means that you have even more intense forms of symptoms. And we're going to be linking all this together with other relevant information later on. Now look at this. Pre-medial prefrontal cortex is affected. Right there. The entire frontality of the brain is known as the PFC, prefrontal cortex. But if you zoom in on the PFC, you realize that they have different regions. We have the medial prefrontal cortex. We have the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is sideways. Right here, we have the orbital prefrontal cortex, and we have different prefrontal cortexes in that region. But I want to focus on the medial prefrontal cortex because studies have implicated it to be affected. MPFC is involved in the extinction of conditioned fear and in the appropriate regulation of negative emotions. Now, before I go into this, you remember that the entire prefrontal cortex from here all the way to the central sulcus right here is part of your prefrontal cortex. Now, that is the seat of your executive function, like focus, attention, judgment, problem solving, like impulse control, forethought, doing the complicated things with regards to social connections, being able to think before you talk, being able to assess the emotional cues and the body language, so that you integrate all those things that you're seeing to inform your judgment, the things that you want to say, or you don't want to say. So doing the complex things so that we can integrate fully into our society and maintain adequate relationship is part of the executive functionality. Now, what happens is that in complex PTSD, the MPFC is suppressed because it's in charge of making sure that it kills excess conditioned fear response. And it's in charge of making sure that your negative emotions do not always overwhelm awareness. But if the MPFC has been suppressed, then you cannot kill the fear that is trying to overwhelm you. You cannot regulate emotions. The emotions will have to be overwhelming and start to affect us deeply. Now look at this. The MPFC serves as a braking system for the amygdala. And that's the linkage. I'm going to be linking different things together now. Your executive function serves as a dampening or dampener for the amygdala. The PFC is like the CEO of the company. Now, liking the entire brain to an organization again, we have the CEO of the company that's supposed to provide problem solving analysis to other departments in the organization. They're supposed to provide adequate supervision and goal-directed actions. This is where we're going. This is what is going on. I'm in charge of this organization. Now, if the PFC has been affected, then there's no adequate supervision for your amygdala. The amygdala goes crazy, firing your fight or flight. There's no braking system. Many times the PFC will say, well, amygdala, just go back to your security room. Don't worry. You don't need to call the police or call the fire brigade or something. You don't need to call the emergency. That is a false alarm. Trust me, that's a false alarm. But if the PFC is being disrupted, usually is the part, one of the reasons is because of the reduced blood flow to the PFC when we've suffered childhood traumas. So studies have shown that it's reduction of the oxygenated blood to the PFC center, and that could eventually lead to the PFC not being able to perform its executive functions. So because the PFC is not serving as the braking system, then we have an amygdala that is going crazy, micromanaging our psyche and body. So a defect in this inhibitory capacity has been linked to exaggerated PTSD symptoms. Now, functional imaging studies of complex trauma show hypoactivity in the MPFC, not carrying its weight as it should. Now, one of the Zoom attendees right now asked a question about ADHD. You realize the link right now, hypoactivation of the executive functions. ADHD is an executive function dysregulation condition when your PFC is not carrying its weight. So when I go to schools and colleges speaking to young people, we say the PFC is offsite most of the time. So if the PFC is offsite or offline, so it's not performing its executive role, it's not providing direction. So different regions of the brain will have to go freestyle. I'm sure you know how you behave when your boss is not at work. You behave differently. Maybe not you, but I'm sure your friend, your colleague does behave differently. Some of them will go for lunch forever, never come back. I'm sure they've never done that. So you realize that the brain regions, different departments of the brain will take law to their own hands, and they'll start to, work too hard or work too little because there's no centralized coordination system that the PFC provides. So you can easily be diagnosed of ADHD. In fact, some studies have shown that more people that now meet the criteria for complex PTSD are more likely to be misdiagnosed as ADHD, as borderline, as dissociative identity disorder. Those are the main three categories of diagnoses that are likely to happen because of the symptoms. You meet all these criteria, and the common denominator is the complex trauma that almost nobody's helping us with at the moment. Okay, I'm not saying that it's not good to get diagnosed, because some people actually eventually get some help by having that diagnosis. But there are underlying issues that uh, we should be dealing with, we should be getting help for, but there are no help there. There's hardly no help. So that is that. So in some things are supposed to be dealt with properly through long-term therapy. Some of those things are being over medicalized. Medication is supposed to help therapy so that all of them go together. But we over rely on medication because of the lack of availability of real help. Individuals with PTSD exhibit decreased volumes of the prefrontal cortex. So that means there's some neurons that have been sacked or been recruited to other activities in the brain. Why? Because of the PFC that is off-site most of the time. When you don't use one part of the brain enough because of the reduced blood flow, oxygenated blood flow, chances are there will be that volume, the neuron, the gray matter volume in that part of the brain will shrink. And that further decreases the effectiveness of the PFC. So you can't think properly. You have a foggy mind. And if the PFC goes, it doesn't work properly. Another part of the brain known as the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, in learning, and stress response, we also have issues. So we're going to the hippocampus. Okay, the hippocampus is extremely important. The hippocampus plays a critical role in memory. Many people knows the hippocampus as the memory center of the organization. That's where the filing cabinets are kept. That's where all the sophisticated computer databases are kept, where things can easily be retrieved, can be searched, can be scanned through. But what we don't realize is that hippocampus is in charge of learning pathways throughout the brain, and it's in charge of our stress regulations. Studies have shown that children who overproduce CRH, the neuropeptide of emotions that we've been talking about, during the early years of life, the excessive CRH production will kill the cells in the hippocampus as well, because there are a large amount of CRH receptors in the hippocampus. I forgot to mention there are a large amount of CRH receptors in the prefrontal cortex as well. So if they are overstimulated, some of them will upregulate, they will increase. Eventually they will downregulate, so they will shrink. So that could also account for the smaller prefrontal cortex found in most CPTSD individuals. But what we're talking about right here has a significant implication on children because of the learning difficulties that could result as a result of the hippocampal dysregulation because of the excess CRH production. And also we have trouble regulating stress, switching off our stress response. I've given you some references there. All these references are searchable. Just copy that and paste that on Google. You'll see that paper. I've tried to make sure that you can easily search your internet and find these papers if you want to do more studies on those. Now, the anterior hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is divided into two areas. Look at the hippocampus right here. Here's the hippocampus. It's labeled as memory there, but it does more than memory. The amygdala is labeled as emotions, but it does more than emotions. So the hippocampus has the anterior, the frontal part of it, which is known as anterior hippocampus, AHPC for short. And we have the posterior, the back of it, which I'm going to talk about. Now, the anterior hippocampus first has a central role in encoding short-term memory. So your short-term memory is stored in the anterior part, the frontal part. It has a central role in encoding in anxiety-related behavior, in stress response, in emotional memory, and in unconditioned fear. The fear that's just developing that you've never seen before, that's not particularly threatened, that you just have to respond to. And also your short-term memory, being able your working memory is part of your short-term memory, being able to be cognitively aware of what you have to do and being organized, understanding different working memory compartments that have to be retrieved to consolidate what is going on right now, so that you become coherent. What we know is that the hippocampus is affected by the excess CRH production, and your hippocampus system starts to malfunction, especially your working memory starts to go. You may still possibly remember what happened 20 years ago, but what happened 20 seconds ago, you start to struggle to figure it out. You start to misplace stuff. And not necessarily that you are developing dementia, but it shows that your levels of cortisol are probably too high, because CRH eventually metamorphosizes into your cortisol when it gets to the adrenal glands. So high CRH levels will most certainly predict high cortisol levels, unless that's an issue with your pituitary gland. I don't want to confuse you with that. We'll get there. So basically, just understand that the anterior hippocampus has a central role in short-term memory and anxiety. The anterior if you look at the anterior hippocampus right here, is directly connected to the PFC through what we know as the white matter structures right there, just under the white matter. They're like the glues, they're the supporting networks of glial cells. Glial means glue from Latin. So your glial cells are used to connect the neurons together to make synaptic connections. So also information travels through the glial, and your PFC quickly goes through to the hippocampus to find out to look at the filing cabinets of memories, to predict whether you should send a signal to your amygdala to fire your fight or flight, or maybe something that's happened in the past that it could access to now conclude that that threat is a false alarm, because I remember this happened 2 days ago or 20 years ago. Is innocuous, is harmless. So then, if you're able to access that through your memory unit, it's going to ask the security officer to stand down. But what studies have shown is that complex trauma severs the glial cells that connect the frontal part of the brain with the anterior parts of the brain of the hippocampus. There's no direct access to the past memories that could help you to navigate day-to-day worries easily. So things are complicated. You're already over full. Now you can't manage day-to-day stresses properly. So that complicates issues. Now, the posterior hippocampus has a central role in encoding long-term memory, in spatial memory, in autobiographical memory, implicit memory of your life, and in contextual fear conditioning. So it does a whole bunch of other things, but it's also affected by excess CRH production and the disconnection between the hippocampus and the frontal part of the brain. Now, the PFC AHPC pathway, which is the connection between the frontal part of the brain and the anterior hippocampus, as I've mentioned, has been disconnected. The disconnectivity of those two regions has been observed in individuals with PTSD, leading to hyperarousal and numbing symptoms. If your thinking brain doesn't have access to the memory unit, to the database in the computer to figure out whether it should stand down the stress response or not, then you're going to constantly be producing stress chemicals, because there's no dampening system for the PFC, for the amygdala. So you feel a sense of numbing, in the sense of numbness because of the excess glutamate. Glutamate is another neurotransmitter that is necessary that is supposed to be released when you increase your cortisol levels. So glutamate eventually increases your endogenous opioid that will make you to feel numb. The purpose of that is to adapt us. Remember the human species, the early humans that will have to suffer physical injuries, and they are still expected to fight their way out of that. So endogenous opioids are released almost like morphine, or natural endogenous painkiller, pain reliever, to keep you alive, to increase your chances of surviving. So excess glutamate activation always comes as standard when you increase your stress levels. So, but in CPTSD, there is excess glutamate activation that eventually provide the derealization, the numbing sensation that we feel in our body. Now, smaller hippocampal volume has been reported in several stress-related psychiatric disorders, including post-traumatic stress. So again, we have a smaller hippocampus. So our memory unit is going. We have issues with learning. We have issues with controlling stress response. The thinking brain shrinks also, and so is the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex that we've looked at. So basically, we have overall small gray matter in the entire brain, and that makes the rest of the neurons in the brain to work too hard, because we don't have enough workers to carry the enormous amount of work that is needed to regulate emotions when we're in survival constantly. Now, that leads me to what is going to bring everything together. Hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. So it's called the HPA axis. Hypothalamic. The hypothalamic is if you're taking notes, just write it down, is the chemical factory in the brain. That's where your stress chemicals are produced. That's where a whole bunch of hormones are produced in the body. That's the seat of our homeostasis, your body regulation system. The pituitary gland is the master gland, and it can easily be remembered as like the shuttle bus. It is the transporter. Transport different raw materials to their destinations. The adrenal glands, you know what that is. It's on top of your kidneys, and that's where your adrenaline is secreted. But for your adrenaline and cortisol to be produced in the adrenal glands, they need the help of your hypothalamic combination with pituitary gland. The initial raw material for your cortisol, which you are now familiar with, CRH, is produced in the hypothalamic center. Then it requires the pituitary gland, that is the truck, the transporter, to take the raw material of the CRH to deliver it into the adrenal glands, where the final production of your cortisol and adrenaline are finalized. So it's known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Now, why is this important? It's extremely important. Now, look at this. This is your hypothalamus, just in your limbic system, in your emotional brain. The hypothalamus produces CRH, and the CRH is delivered to the pituitary gland, which is the shuttle bus. The pituitary gland secretes its own hormones, known as ACTH. That includes the CRH that is already secreted, and transport them to your adrenal glands on top of your kidneys. Then your cortisol is produced, and your adrenaline is produced. We have another neurotransmitter for your sympathetic nervous system that's known as norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is always released whenever cortisol is released. So it's part of your hormone for stress as well. But your norepinephrine is secreted in the part of the brainstem known as the locus coeruleus. So the cortisol level, the cortisol production always secretes the norepinephrine production. For norepinephrine, by the way, norepinephrine is the same thing as the noradrenaline. Norepinephrine is the American terminology. In Europe, we use noradrenaline. So epinephrine is adrenaline in America, and norepinephrine is noradrenaline in Europe. So your norepinephrine, NE, and your CRH, they are the biomarkers for how stressed you are. If they measure your CRH levels and it's too much, that could predict a lot of issues in the past. And also, if they measure your NE levels, your norepinephrine levels, because norepinephrine is the primary neurotransmitter for your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight. And your fight or flight, your contraction and expansion is not just for your stress, it's keeping your heart beating every day. So it's used for other things. It's used in your enteric nervous system, your gut, your gastrointestinal tract. So your norepinephrine, your fight or flight system, is not just for your fight or flight, like for stress. It's used to keep your heart contracting and expanding. You need both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic activations to work in different regions of the brain for the brain and body to be able to function well. Now, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is the body's major stress response for stress, producing cortisol and adrenaline. And adrenaline, as I've explained there. The hippocampus, now listen, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex inhibit the HPA axis activities. Do you get that? That's significant. The word inhibit is like they serve as the braking system for your stress response. Now, in the previous slides, we've established that the hippocampus is not functioning as it should because it shrunk. We finalized that the prefrontal cortex is not functioning as it should. Now, that means they cannot regulate the HPA axis, your stress response. So the stress response go crazy without any braking system being meted out to control the overactivation of your stress response. Now the amygdala, now look at this, the amygdala and the brainstem neurons stimulate the HPA axis. But that is the wrong thing because the amygdala that we've established to be working too hard. So it keeps working too hard, keep stimulating more stress response. And the brainstem is the survival headquarters. This is brainstem right here. This is survival headquarters. This is where your survival activities are detected from. This is where all the Zoom meetings are taking place about how to keep you alive. So the brainstem stimulates. In other words, it encourages the activation of your survival pathway. And the amygdala does the same. But the two parameters, the two elements of the brain that are supposed to provide the checks and balances are struggling. You can see how complex the PTSD is with regards to the biochemical effect. Now, low cortisol levels at the time of exposure to trauma may predict the development of PTSD. I'll read that again. Low cortisol levels at the time of exposure to trauma may predict the development of PTSD. Why? What studies have shown is that if you've gone through some childhood traumas that have already broken down your HPA axis, so the HPA axis is not working properly, then you now have other major stressors. So your HPA axis cannot increase your cortisol levels because the pathways are broken. Because of that, chances are you will develop PTSD. I know it's a little bit confusing, but in many CPTSD sufferers or survivors, studies have found low cortisol levels beyond the baseline levels in many people with CPTSD. Because what happens is that when you've overproduced cortisol for so long, the cortisol receptors, they get worn out. So they are not being appropriated. You might still have enough cortisol, but they are not being appropriated to serve as what is known as anti-inflammatory uh, hormone, because eventually, actually, your cortisol is anti-inflammatory if it's produced in a normal level. If it's overproduced, it becomes pro-inflammatory. That's another dual functionality effect. That's what makes researchers feel stupid, because many things that would do one thing, if it's overdone, we do the opposite. If you look at research in this area for the last 50 years, it's always very controversial, very, very complex. It's hard for you to get your head around it, because something that could be a goodie can also be a baddie depending on the dosage. So that is why there's this sentence that is very famous in neuroscientific scholars community that says that is the dosage that is the poison. The dosage is the poison. Because your cortisol, that's supposed to help you to keep inflammation down, if it's overly produced because of stress or chronic stress, it becomes pro-inflammatory. I'm sure you remember that cortisol, or what is known as glucocorticoids, which cortisol is part of, is actually used to treat really chronic diseases and illnesses like stroke, like AIDS, like hypertension, like different other autoimmune or excess inflammatory responsive conditions, so that it could keep the inflammation down. So synthetic cortisol could be administered for a lot of conditions. So, but what studies are showing is that some people are already low in cortisol because the pathway to cortisol has been broken down. For example, now if you're still with me, hey, are you still with me? Good, good. Now, CRH will have to travel to the pituitary, and the CRH, part of the raw materials in the CRH molecules will be converted to ACTH, adrenocortical cortical hormone, adrenocorticotropin hormone. So the ACTH absorbs the CRH molecules, okay, to become ACTH. So on the pituitary, we have to transport it to the adrenal glands. But now, for the CRH to be recognized in the pituitary gland, it must have enough CRH receptors. That is, those are the keyholes, so that the doors will be opened for the CRH to be appropriated in the cells. But if the CRH receptors in the pituitary gland have been downregulated, they've been worn out because of the too much CRH over the years. So when CRH comes, they are not being recognized. So that means ACTH will not be produced, and that means cortisol will not be produced. So that pathway, that cortisol pathway, could have been degenerated earlier on in life. And when more problems start to surface in adulthood, it becomes even more dysregulated, more counterintuitive. We have low levels of cortisol. And what that means to your inflammation is that the inflammation runs riot, it runs havoc, because very low cortisol levels, as bad as very high cortisol levels, because adequate amount of cortisol should keep down the inflammation in the brain and body. Excuse me. Now, sustained cortisol exposure degenerates the hippocampal neurons, interferes with the retrieval of traumatic memories, and impairs neurogenesis. So that means traumatic amnesia could happen. You forget a whole bunch of things have happened to you. You can't tell a coherent story of what happens to you. So neurogenesis is the formation of new neurons. So your brain cannot evolve to learn new things. And being able to heal from trauma means your brain will have to go through plenty of neurogenesis, making more neurons, new neurological pathways. So too much cortisol will dampen that. And what we know about CPTSD is that we have plenty of CRH. We have plenty of cortisol that are not being appropriated. And in some cases, we have low levels of cortisol that are too low, below baseline, that will make the inflammation to go crazy. High inflammation will release the endogenous cortisol. So you eventually end up with more cortisol. Now, complex trauma can trigger thyroid abnormalities as well by breaking down that's another axis, hypothalamic pituitary thyroid pathway. So your thyroid glands secrete a whole bunch of hormones that help you to distribute energy appropriately in your body. We have three systems in the brain and body. We have the first system, accumulate energy. Accumulate energy. That is your digestive system. That's why you eat. When you eat, the food is energy, is accumulated, and eventually is dispersed, is digested, and the nutrients are extracted, and the garbage is dispersed through through your feces. Now we have the second system, that is the storage system. That is your blood sugar insulin system. It stores energy. And we have the last one, which is your metabolization, utilization of energy system. The energy, the part of the system that distributes energy that is stored. So your thyroid gland is important for how you use energy. And if it's malfunction, we can easily have issues with the energy system. Your neurons have issues with energy. Your muscles have an issue with energy. And chronic fatigue syndrome and other fatigue-based conditions could result. So complex trauma also trigger the thyroid abnormalities, which can complicate our symptoms. Now, I want to kind of summarize this with you, because a lot of things that we're going to be doing this afternoon will be we focus on repairing all those things that we've talked about today. But we do them in a way that will reduce the CRH production, will reduce the cortisol production, will increase the BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that helps spur the formation of new neurons, the connections of new synaptic connections that could increase calmness, that could increase relaxation, that could start to reduce excess symptoms. It takes time, but it's possible. Now, neurobiological regions affected in complex traumatic stress disorder. These are just summaries of what we've talked about, so that you could quickly increase your understanding about what individual region does, and if it's malfunctioned, what could happen to my emotions, to my life, to my symptoms. Hippocampus, the memory center. In complex trauma is changed. We have reduced volume and reduced activity. So alter stress responses. You cannot control your stress properly, and you cannot kill the stress of the past. So you are more likely to have emotional flashbacks constantly. Amygdala, what it does is that the amygdala increases its activity during CPTSD. So it promotes hypervigilance and impairs discrimination of threat. So you use the same big blankets to judge every single threat or potential threat. Even people who are good people, they could be made bad people. Stressors that are supposed to be just normal stress could be a catastrophic stress with regards to the way you appraise it. So cortex, reduce prefrontal cortex volume, it dysregulates your executive functions. You can't focus, you can't impulse control, you have problem for thinking before you act. So so that's that reduced anterior cingulate volume, because part of your cortex. So impairs the extension of fear responses. So we are more likely to overcompensate fears through compulsive behaviors. Decreased medial prefrontal cortex activation, poor executive functions, impairs the extension of fear responses. We've talked about that. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, when it's dysregulated, we have hypocortisolism. This inhibits, that means it encourages CRH and norepinephrine and upregulates responses to stress. So because of the hypothalamic center, if it's not working properly, we generate low cortisol. Because of the low cortisol levels, the CRH production goes crazy, and the norepinephrine production go crazy, and we increase our stress response. Usually, the HPA axis serves as the braking system to your immune system, and the immune system serves as a braking system to your HPA axis. So if your HPA axis works too hard, your immune system should come in and try to balance it out. But if the HPA and vice versa, but if the HPA axis breaks down, the immune system will go crazy because there's no body that is serving as the braking system. So we have excess inflammation. That is why we can easily be susceptible to all the inflammation-based conditions. Sustained increased levels of CRH. So it blunts ACTH response. So that means the CRH receptors in the pituitary gland that's supposed to give birth to ACTH can't be responsive anymore. So we have the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. So abnormal T3, part of the department of the thyroid glands, and the T4 ratio. So that increase of anxiety. Neurochemicals affected in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I've spoken about all this in some ways. If I've not spoken about them, I'll touch on them. And now, your catecholamines are your dopamines and your norepinephrines. Look at those means. Whatever starts with means, or finishes with means rather. Even your serotonin is part of your catecholamines. Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, adrenaline. So they are all catecholamines group. So your catecholamines are secreted to mediate your stress response. So in this case, increased dopamine levels have been spotted in complex PTSD. And what that means is that it interferes with fear conditioning by our mesolimbic system. So if you produce too much dopamine, so that means you're more likely to remember your fears. Because dopamine stimulates. It's the motivation hormone. So you remember your fear longer than expected. Part of that is because of the glutamate. I've mentioned glutamate, which is the excitatory neurotransmitter. Whenever dopamine is increased, glutamate is increased as well. Glutamate helps you with your neuroplasticity. So if you increase dopamine for wrong reasons like PTSD, so that means you're ingraining your fears into your brain structures even stronger. So increased norepinephrine levels. Norepinephrine, we've talked about that, is the noradrenaline. It increases. So the effect of that is that it increases arousal, startle response, encoding of fear memories. Serotonin is also part of the catecholamines, and there's decreased concentration of 5-HT. This is the molecular formula for your serotonin. It's the same thing. 5-HT is serotonin. So you have reduced serotonin levels in your body. So you're more likely to suffer from depression as well. Now, all these regions, they are based in the brainstem, the survival headquarters. That's where we have the largest concentration of serotonin after your gut in the brain. In the brain, the brainstem contains the largest concentration of serotonin receptors. So it disturbs dynamic between amygdala and hippocampus. Serotonin should also help dampen down the amygdala aggression and the hippocampus vulnerability. But when you are low in serotonin, we have issues. Now, amino acids. The amino acids are important because some of them serve as neurotransmitters and hormones at the same time. And one of the most important amino acids with regards to your anxiety relief is GABA. GABA means gamma aminobutyric acid. It should help you to decrease your anxiety. But unfortunately, in post-complex PTSD, there's a reduced level of GABA, so you have more anxiety. So compromises your anxiolytic effect. Anxiolytic means anxiety relief effect. So body's natural anxiety relief effort. So we're more likely to have more anxiety. That's reduced GABA concentration in the brain of those who have complex PTSD. You see, there's so much against us that we just need more self-compassion than to become part of the problem by self-shaming, self-hating. So we're going to be dealing with that in the afternoon. Increased glutamate. So I've spoken about glutamate, which is the excitatory neurotransmitter. It makes other neurons around them to become excited, to pass on the information. GABA is one of the major inhibitory neurotransmitters. It makes the neurons around them not to fire, not to pass on the information. That is why GABA helps with anxiety. In fact, we have a supplement called GABA. Some people use that for anxiety. I'm not recommending that, but we know that GABA inhibits. It has anxiolytic effect. So, but GABA is supposed to regulate the action of glutamate because the glutamate is opposite. It makes the brain neurons fire to work harder. GABA makes them to work lesser. So the GABA is decreased in CPTSD. Unfortunately, the glutamate goes crazy. So foster derealization and dissociation. Do you know why this happens? Because glutamate helps increase the body's endogenous opioid. It's known as B endorphins. Now look at it, that endogenous opioids. You know that beta endorphin. And that will foster numbing, stress-induced analgesia, dissociation, just like what glutamate is known for. It's known for the foster derealization and dissociation. Now we have another peptide known as plasma neuropeptide Y. Neuro, just put neuro there. Peptide Y. The neuropeptide Y helps us to reduce our anxiety as well, just like GABA. Studies have shown that people with CPTSD have reduced plasma neuropeptide Y. Plasma means the part of the fluid, colorless part of the blood where this molecule flows. Has decreased neuropeptide Y. So it's supposed to help your CRH to be regulated and your norepinephrine, the two major molecules for your stress. Why? Because of that, if you have a low concentration of NPY, so your CRH goes crazy. So leaves CRH and NE unopposed and regulates stress response. Of course, we have the cerebral spinal fluid, beta endorphin levels. So it fosters numbing, stress-induced analgesia, and dissociation. So now all the symptoms that we've talked about, there are neurological, biochemical reactions to them and explanations to them, and that's what I've tried to provide without confusing you too much. There's no way we'll go deep into the brain science without you wanting to have a nap in the middle of it, because if I had a nap, okay. But hopefully you have the resources that you can visit several times to try to piece together what is going on neurochemically, because that is important. If you can master that and look for a non-complicated way to explain to a client or to explain to your brother, your sister, somebody who's going through this, it helps them to relax a bit. That it's not my fault. I'm not going crazy. These are the things that are happening in my brain because of what I've suffered. So I have to be more patient on myself. So ladies and gentlemen, you can now see why I asked you to go and have a cup of tea before the second session. So this is the end of the second session, and this will lead us to a longer break for our lunch break. So any question at all before I go? I've got two or three questions before our lunch break. Let's see whether some people have been asking some questions. So the question is, and it's a good question, are we going to have access to the recording of these sessions? Absolutely, yes. because you need to watch this again and again so that you can kind of debunk the myth behind these things I've just told you. So you will have access to the recording, possibly by tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. I will send you the recording. How would one go about getting a diagnosis for CPTSD? That's another question. Now, many GPs, many investigators, they still use the DSM-5 criteria, and it doesn't have CPTSD in it. It's only the WHO, International Classification of Diseases, compiled by the World Health Organization, that has been defunded by Trump. They are the only ones who have this classification. There's some researchers are using that to help people diagnose. There are more people being diagnosed with CPTSD now because of that classification protocol. But it just been able to understand the health professionals in your local areas that could diagnose it. Some GPs still use the DSM-5. Some professionals still use the DSM-5. So you are more likely to be diagnosed as borderline because it's in the DSM-5, or dissociative identity disorders. They will look for something closer to the symptoms that you're displaying. But we do know that a lot of people we have complex trauma, and they could be diagnosed as ADHD, as autism, as Asperger's, as dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder, and different other individual diagnoses. But we know that the underlying causality is a lot of things that people have gone through in the past that they've not been able to integrate. In the second session, on the afternoon session, we're going to look at the recovery pathway. So if you have experienced CPTSD, are we more primed for PTSD from a different trauma at a later stage? If CPTSD is not addressed, yes. Now, if you've gone through childhood trauma or any form of trauma that's so strong enough to give us complex trauma, your stress threshold is already been weakened. If there are other big breakers in your life, you will feel it. It will be very strong because the natural adaptive energy of the body is already oversaturated. And we're going to be looking at this, how to increase our resiliency, the resilience of the brain, of the body, bring back stability, bring back resilience, so that we can cope better with the day-to-day stressors. Because if you cannot cope with the day-to-day stressors, you don't have time to actually go back and make sense of the past. This will not be easy, but it's possible. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's Wale Ladipo signing off for our lunch break. I'm going to give you 1 hour so that you can come down and have a nap. So 1 hour, we come back for 1:45, and I will see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.